It's time for Global Insights, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. After months of public anger and protests against the ruling elite amid worsening fuel, food and medicine shortages, as well as the flight of the sitting president, Sri Lanka's members of parliament have picked the acting president, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, as the official replacement. Having won the majority of the presidential vote cast by MPs on Wednesday, Wickremesinghe will finish his predecessor's term and take on the various economic and political crises crippling the country. But the six-time PM is deeply unpopular with the public, who see him as being part or even the cause of the problems that they're faced with. So why did lawmakers elect the controversial figure, and what lies ahead for the crisis-struck country? Well, we discussed this today with Marlon, Ariyasinghe, Senior Assistant Editor at Himal Southasian, and Choong-jae, Senior Research Fellow of the Centre for Area Studies at Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us this morning in Seoul. And first of all, my first question to you, Mr. Ariyasinghe. Now, the Prime Minister, he was voted yesterday to replace the President. And Mr. Wickremesinghe, though, he was blamed for really worsening the debt and energy crises, not really acting to resolve it properly. But now he's been elected as President by members of the Parliament. So how are members of the public really reacting to this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, it's difficult to gauge the public sentiment at large right now. But if you have to go by the protest groups at the main protest site in Colombo, I mean, yesterday there was a silent protest against the appointment. And the day before, they burnt an effigy of Ranil Wickremesinghe. And the rallying cry has been quite consistent for the last 6 months. Protesters and the public have been loud and clear about their demands that both Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Ranil Wickremesinghe should resign. So protest groups have declared, as you also mentioned, that the protests will continue. In the general public, sentiment is very difficult to gauge right now, but the protest groups have declared that they will continue.
And well, what is the reason, Mr. Ariyasinghe, that members of the Parliament picked this figure? I mean, given just how deeply unpopular he is.
Well, the reason for this is, I think he held the majority. So the governing party, which were previously under the Rajapaksas, were held by Ranil Wickremesinghe. So, I mean, simply it's a numbers game. So, because he held the majority, he is now the president.
And now, Professor Choong-jae, now, what is your reaction to Prime Minister Wickremesinghe's rather controversial victory?
Yeah, to sum up my thought from beginning, it's very anxiety. The Ranil Wickremesinghe, the new president, emphasized differentiations from the previous government. But the question is whether the public perceived that way. When the important political leaderships, such as President, Prime Minister, and the Finance Minister are stable, the bailout negotiations with IMF, which is the most urgent and the hope of escaping from the economic crisis, can be quickly pursued. Currently, there are no coalitions or the political forces with a strong public support. If Sri Lanka goes to early president elections or general elections, it will take more time, but we cannot be optimistic about the outcome. Such an unstable political leadership appears as a delay in the negotiations with the IMF, which in turn prolongs the suffering period of the people and may continue a vicious cycle in which the public's distrust of the political leadership rises again.
And of course, Dr. Cho, now a national crisis rarely stays within its borders these days, and a lot of Sri Lanka's Asian neighbours are watching very closely. And what does Sri Lanka's situation mean for the regional and international community?
Yeah, the trigger of the economic crisis was a failure in the foreign exchange management. But in fact, the reason Sri Lanka has been pushed to the brink is the surge in international energy prices following the Russia invasion of Ukraine. Now, after the 30 years civil war ended in 2009, almost all the policies such as export and strategic industry promotions, large-scale infrastructure developments, and financial and foreign exchange management were not properly implemented. In a situation so well, the fundamental was very weak due to the effect of the Easter bomb terror in 2019 and COVID-19 in 2020. Sri Lanka was hit by the shock of the global inflations caused by the Russia-Ukraine war. In other words, Sri Lanka has mismanaged its economy and had very bad luck. In this regard, I believe that the international community, which made unavoidable stray bully to Sri Lanka, should be criticized as well.
Well, it would be fair to say that it was the former ruling elite that caused the problems, and it's the Sri Lankan citizens who are now having to deal with the consequences. Mr. Ariyasinghe, now, what is the situation over there? How are people really living day to day due to the consequence of months and months of inaction by politicians?
Yeah, I mean, although we have had all these protests, the crisis still continues. There are daily power cuts, and there is a severe fuel shortages, along with medical shortages and shortages of medical equipment. But it's the fuel shortages, I think, it's really hitting the Sri Lankans very hard. Because I mean, as you might see along the near the fuel sheds, there are huge lines, and now for the last week we haven't had. I mean, we basically haven't had fuel. The general public have not been able to access fuel, and I think yesterday there was a fuel shipment which arrived, and the Minister of Energy has come up with a plan to distribute fuel evenly. But yeah, I mean, the inflation is skyrocketing for the last few months, and day to day, like wage earners are suffering immensely. So yeah, it's we are very much still in crisis.
And the question is, Mr. Ariyasinghe, the Prime Minister, who is now going to be the official president, he had months and months to deal with this, and while most people think he didn't deal with it at all, and safeguarding people's livelihoods and getting Sri Lanka out of this multifaceted crisis, is it going to be possible for him to do that? Do people have confidence that the new president is going to take very decisive steps to do this?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Now, he has had over 2 months since he was appointed PM to alleviate this condition. But of course, I think people also understand that these are deep-seated issues. This economic crisis is stemming from, as my fellow analyst said, is stemming from gross mismanagement and misguided policies by this government. And also, I mean, we could also attribute some other responsibility to the COVID pandemic and the economic recession that that resulted from that. But the president, he has a huge task ahead of him. That is to get the country back on track, get the country's economy back on track, and also to conclude the IMF negotiations. And also, since the parliament itself is quite fractured, getting them to work towards a common goal would be another great challenge that he would face. So whether he's able to do that, now, along with that, he needs to also appease the people, appease these protest groups who have not accepted his appointment. So it's going to be very difficult for the president in the coming few months. Yeah, we will just have to see how he will deal with it.
Well, Dr. Cho, now, Sri Lanka's economic growth rate is expected to decrease by more than 6% this year, according to the governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. And, well, what does this mean for foreign companies, including South Korean firms, which are some of the biggest investors in the Southeast Asian nation?
Yeah, currently it's known that there are about 60 Korean companies and about 600 Koreans in Sri Lanka. As we saw in the media, considering the long lines to buy fuel for automobiles and longer the outage time rather than the power supply time, it must be very difficult situations for local Korean companies as well as Korean companies. In particular, the economic damages to the self-employed would be greater. Development cooperation's project through the ODAs are also not being promoted properly. However, since the scale of the trade and investment between Korea and Sri Lanka has not lost relatively, the impact on Korean economy is not increasing. Also, it is fortunate that no direct damage to our residents has been reported yet, but they are seems in a very anxious time. So hopefully Sri Lanka will get out of the economic crisis as soon as possible.
And Dr. Cho, what kind of strategy or action is needed by South Korea to really respond to this economic crisis in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, our economy is totally different with the situation of the Sri Lanka, especially the economic fundamental is very strong. However, unfavorable environment is gradually being developed for our economy, which is highly dependent on the foreign trade. The global economic growth rate is significantly lower than initially expected, and global inflation pressures are rising, leading to a phase of the stagflations. It is necessary to prepare more actively for economic management, keeping in mind that the second and the third Sri Lanka can continue to emerge. We should continue to check the supply chains related to the individual countries.
Of course, neighbouring countries in the region do need to prepare to respond to this as well. But Mr. Ariyasinghe, now, what can other countries do to help safeguard the livelihoods of everyday Sri Lankan citizens?
Well, that is a difficult question. I guess our neighboring countries, so for example, taking India and China, they've been helping with credit lines, with a lot of aid. But at this point, I think we need to get our tourism industry back on track. And I think because that will bring in much needed foreign exchange, because one of the main issues that we have is that we have no foreign exchange for these essential imports that we need to run the country. So getting tourism back on track would be one of the ways that other countries can help us. And of course, buying our exports. But we don't have a burgeoning export industry. So these are some of the ways that other countries can help Sri Lanka.
And lastly, Mr. Ariyasinghe, now throughout this crisis, the protests that mostly began in April, we were able to see different ethnic groups really come together and call for change. So what do you hope to see in the future of Sri Lanka's democracy?
Yeah, I think this narrative has been widely circulated, that the protests, for the protests, Sri Lankans are coming together despite their differences for one collective common cause. I was at most of these protests, and yes, it's encouraging to see that. But as a country with a long history of communal violence and nationalistic policies that hurt communal harmony, we have to take these calls of unity with a pinch of salt. The protests themselves are not equal. How protesters are treated in Colombo and how they're treated by the armed forces in other parts of the country, like the north and east, are vastly different. But there is a sense of awareness of this difference by the people in the south, which I think is a very good first step. So I think that is something to be optimistic about, in the fact that Sri Lankans from all segments of life came together in this one common goal to say no to the government that they were that were taking all these misguided and misguided decisions, and so they kind of took power to their own hands, which is, I think, is again another encouraging sign.
That was Marlon Ariyasinghe, Senior Assistant Editor at Himal, Southasian, and Choong-jae, Senior Research Fellow of the Centre for Area Studies at Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.